Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. This is my VR to Marlena Teresa and her tag Tarot to the Extreme or Tarot Extremes. The original video has both of those tags on it, so I've put both of those tags on my VR. I will link to Marlena Teresa below. I'll also link to my friend Julie over at Peekaboo Rose, whose VR was the first video that I saw of this tag. So, as the name suggests, and I'm sure everyone is aware because as usual I'm slow on the uptake when it comes to tags and there's lots of VRs out there already, this is a tag in which some different sets of opposites are presented to us, or some differences anyway, and we come up with a deck for each category. So I will timestamp below the different sets of opposites, but I'm not going to put the decks that I chose in the description box, so you'll have to wait and see. So the first prompt is Minimalist versus Maximalist, and for this I went completely just based on deck aesthetics, nothing to do with how these decks read for me or anything like that, just looks really. And so for the Minimalist deck that I chose, I picked the Orbifold Tarot. This is the back, and it came edged in black like this. And this is a minimalist deck because it's very abstract, and it's based on color, and colors correspond to different elements in this deck. But there are no representations of people. There are no representations of animals or anything like that. It is very minimalist, as you can see. And as you go up through the suits, they get a little bit more complex with more circles representing the different cards. So it is definitely my most minimal deck in terms of its aesthetic. It is quite a complex deck when you get into the color patterns, particularly on the majors and which elements are being represented as corresponding in each of the majors. But the art style, definitely my most minimalist deck. My Maximalist deck I have in a pouch that Kelly Bear made, and this is without a doubt my most brightly colorful deck in my collection, and that is why I can think of this one as Maximalist in its appearance, and that one is Queer Tarot. This is really bright. And it has a lot going on, as the backs suggest. There's a lot of pattern in this deck on the clothing that the people are wearing. It's very, very neon. And there's a lot of fashion statements in this deck. There's symbolism in this deck. You can see there on the outfit, the pink maned horses and things. It's very busy. And the font is a different color on different cards, and it's just a lot. It is a lot going on. So this one for sure I think meets the criteria of a maximalist deck, because every bright color, every pattern, every shape that could be in here is in here. And in addition to all that color, there's also a flying disembodied cat head. What is more maximalist than that? So, that's a pretty opposite styles, I think. Minimalist and maximalist, the Orbifold Tarot and the Queer Tarot. The next one is daytime versus nighttime. And I interpreted this mostly in terms of when I might use the deck. And certainly lots of decks I would use at any time of day. I don't think of them as particularly specific in that sense. But these are the two that I've come up with that would be the most kind of daytime use deck and nighttime use deck. So for daytime deck, I chose Tarot Sereine by Wandering Oracle, which is of course a mermaid deck. It has this great shine on the backs, and it's a very, to me, beachy kind of deck. Obviously, you know, the beach exists at both daytime and nighttime, but there's something very sunny to me about this deck with its colors. You know, it's nice, light and breezy, summery color palette. Makes me think that I would want to read with this one out on a sunny day. And so for that reason, this is the deck that I chose as my daytime deck. And the nighttime deck that I chose, I know that I've probably read with at all different times of day, but this is a deck that I think really lends itself to being read by candlelight, and that's why I picked a nighttime deck, and that is the Marigold Tarot by Amrit Brar. This is a favorite. This is a long-time favorite deck for me, and it has gold gilding, and it's all black, white, and gold, and this just looks fabulous in a candlelit setting. And for me to be doing a reading by candlelight, that is going to be a nighttime reading for me. My reading table is right beside a big window in our bedroom, so I don't usually read by candlelight in the middle of the daytime because I have lots of natural light to work with. But this one, this is a candlelight deck for sure, with all of that metallic gold. So that is my nighttime deck based on when I would use it the most, the Marigold Tarot. So that pair of opposites, Tarot Sirène for the daytime deck and the Marigold Tarot for the nighttime deck. Now the next set of opposites is Best Shuffle and Worst Shuffle. And I will say I'm not good with a bad shuffle. I have moved the odd deck along because I didn't like the shuffle. I really want a deck that feels great to shuffle. So for the deck that I think is the best shuffle in my collection, or one of them, I chose the La Flora Tarot. This deck comes in a box like this. Just getting it out so that I don't mix in the extra cards here. And this cardstock is nice and flexible, but also sturdy. And hopefully you can see here, if you're unfamiliar with this deck, that this is linen. It is textured. And I love shuffling linen cardstock. So I could have just as easily picked for the best shuffle Landback Tarot. I could have picked the Fifth Spirit Tarot. These are also linen finish. I had this deck already out, so I've chosen to show it. And for me, linen is just no sticking, slides easily. I overhand shuffle. I don't do the bridge and riffle, though you could with this cardstock for sure. It just is easy to me. And even on a large deck like the Landback Tarot shuffles really well because of the linen cardstock. And to me, it's not that surprising that the cardstock type that tends to be used for playing cards, which get obviously shuffled a lot, would be one that I would really enjoy shuffling. It's just a smooth shuffling experience. And I like that. I don't want too much to be, thinking about shuffling being challenging when I'm working with a deck. So best shuffle for me is a thicker linen cardstock. And for me, that one is represented by La Flora Tarot. Worst shuffle. I'm sorry, deck. You're the worst shuffle. I don't keep a lot of decks in my collection that I think are not good shuffles, but this one I have a real love for, so I keep it around. And that is the big-sized Gorgons Tarot. So this deck, already you can see it's round. Round is sometimes a more challenging shuffle just by virtue of the shape being something we're not used to. It is also large, very large. So like this is a standard tarot size. And this is longer than the standard tarot size. So that's challenging. And the cardstock, I'm sorry, is shit. It's sticky shiffer. Shiny. There's my ring light. Shiny, sticky, shiffer in an awkward size and an awkward shape. I have pretty big hands. Longer than an octave reach. And I can get my hands around this deck, but still it shuffles in these big chunks because it sticks. And I easily get into a mess with this deck. It is doable for me. You could also just put it on the table and kind of just swish it around. It's doable, but it is not pleasant. And it takes my full concentration. I almost said cooperation, not cooperation. It takes my full concentration to shuffle this well and not make a mess. Because it is sticky and huge and round and thick and is inclined to go all over the place. So that is my worst shuffle. My opposites being best shuffle, La Flora Tarot, linen cardstock that is lovely. It's for folks who haven't seen this deck in person, this is akin to something like Pagan Otherworlds, would be very similar to this. Worst shuffle, big, round, sticky Gorgons Tarot, which is a deck that I adore, but my goodness, if it ever comes out in a better cardstock, I will buy it in a second. The next set of themes to choose a deck for is confronting and comforting. And now I will just say, like, once I got to here, I don't think of this as a set of opposites at all. For me, I love decks that are both confronting and comforting. I think it is entirely possible to be both at the same time. For a deck to be both, for a interaction to be both. And I think that when there is the possibility of both, confronting something difficult and comfort, or being comforted in some way through that process that can be difficult, I think that that's a really great and valuable thing. So I don't actually think that these are opposites or extremes, but in the spirit of the tag, I did, of course, pick a deck for each. So for the confronting deck, I chose the Anima Mundi Tarot by Megan Weirweeden. And I picked this one for a couple of reasons. It's a pippish animal deck. I've had this deck for a very long time, and it continues to be one of my favorite decks to read with. Some of these really, simplistic almost images are just perfection to me. I love this deck. But it is a confronting one in that it does not shy away from depicting difficult imagery with animals. So if you don't want to see that, I would suggest to jump ahead to the next timestamp. It doesn't shy away from challenging imagery. I know that animal decks that do this are not necessarily decks for everyone. I respect that, have no issue with that. I find a deck like this to be potentially challenging. It's quite confronting in that sense. I also find just the readings that I've had with it, it tends to go there, you know. It's not one that is going to necessarily give an easy answer. And again, that's entirely subjective. Somebody might experience this as a comforting deck primarily, but you know, with imagery like this, I do experience this as confronting deck for sure. You know, the human being the devil, I think, can push particular, you know, confronting particular issues and ideas that are important to confront. You can see the baby has passed away there. The baby penguin. This is a sad one. So this one is my confronting deck, and it is a favorite. I love this deck, Anima Mundi Tarot. And I decided to pick an animal deck for the other prompt for this one, which is comforting. Right? Just, I don't know, I thought that was interesting. So for a comforting deck, I chose Considerate Cat Tarot by Madeleine Bélanger, a deck inspired by rescue cats. And Madeleine, who created this deck, fosters cats. And I love that. And I love that this deck celebrates foster cats. And I experience this deck as very much a comforting one. It has a very gentle, soft kind of color palette. You know, it's a beautiful deck. It doesn't go into that kind of confronting imagery with the animals being impaled, you know, like the Anima Mundi does. So to get an example, I mean, it does have, I guess, it has a skeleton for the death card. Just looking for some of the perhaps more typically difficult depictions here. You know, a 3 of swords, you know, you're not going to see the swords impaling a cat in this deck. They're certainly hanging on the wall over the cat, but there's not that sense of stabbing as the Anima Mundi deck has. It's, I would say, a much gentler imagery than the Anima Mundi. And this deck gives great readings too. And I think that both, you know, confronting decks and comforting decks, you know, I don't think one is better than the other. I think that all of those have a place. And so I picked Anima Mundi Tarot and Considerate Cat Tarot. But before I move on, I wanted to just share a couple of decks that I think for me really do both. Decks that can be both confronting and comforting, and at times, you know, in the same reading, in the same reading for me in ways that I find really helpful. So I picked 2 of those. The first one that I find both confronting and comforting is the Many Queens Tarot by Letty Jane Rennekamp. And I particularly bought this deck to work with around kind of body-related issues. This deck has a lot of body diversity. There's a lot of body hair and larger bodies. I read it as a very explicitly queer deck. I experience this deck as a very empowering deck, and I find comfort in that. You know, but it's also one that is confronting for me and has been a supportive deck for me to, you know, confront some internalized things around my body and embodiment, but has done so in a simultaneously confronting and comforting way. So I really appreciate decks that are able to do that. Another deck that I think does that really well and that I cherish for its ability to do so is the Slow Hauler Tarot. I suspect that this one, most people would probably class this in the more confronting side of things. However, the guidebook for this deck, more than any other guidebook I've ever read, reads like it was written by people that I know and love very much. Friends, family. And it is definitely both confronting and comforting. It challenges a lot of status quo ideas very explicitly in ways that are not always easy, but there's so much love there as well at the same time, and it's very much challenging the way things are from a place of love, a place of radical love, self-love as well. And so I really appreciate this deck as simultaneously confronting and comforting. So definitely decks can be both. I don't think that they're opposites. But I can definitely see some decks being, much more one than the other. So I can make sense of the prompt in that way. Next is everyday versus every so often. For my everyday deck, I chose Afro Tarot 2. This deck is just a really cool, very much Smith-Waite inspired deck that I really enjoy. And it has rapidly become one of my favorite kind of Smith-Waite style decks in my collection. I really like these images. I like how colorful it is. I like the guidebook, which came physically and also exists digitally, and you can get this guidebook digitally online whether you have the deck or not. It's definitely worth checking out. And so this deck is one that, it doesn't to me feel particularly seasonal. It doesn't feel particularly daytime or nighttime. It doesn't feel limited in those kinds of ways necessarily. So for me, that is what makes it more of an everyday deck. It doesn't feel like it would be confined to one time of year or time of day or anything like that. And in my experience, it isn't. I like reading with this deck all the time. So I chose that one for my everyday deck. For my only so often or every so often deck, I chose a deck that I really only use every so often. I got it knowing I would only use it every so often. It's very, in some ways, not my style, this deck. It's pretty far from what I go for most of the time. And that is the Wildwood Tarot. And the reason that I picked this, knowing that I would only use it every so often, is that I chose this deck to use in only particular contexts related to Druidry and my Druidry practice. The deck is not explicitly a Druid deck. Certainly there are some tarot decks that are, but it feels very Druidic to me. The court cards are all animals. And, unlike basically every other deck I like, it does have keywords. I tend to ignore them. But it's a deck that feels very Druid to me. It has this kind of Celtic knotwork on the back. There's a lot of kind of mythology-related depictions and concepts that relate to Celtic mythology and worldviews that lend themselves to thinking about in the context of Druidry. So this is one that I take out on solstices and equinoxes, for example, that if I want to incorporate divination into druid ritual, and for some reason I want to do that with tarot and not with something else like, say, then this is the deck that I go for that. It is very specifically my druid practice deck. I don't use it in any other context than specifically druidry related readings. So that's my every so often is the Wildwood Tarot, and my everyday is the Afro Tarot 2, which is to me, a great Smith-Waite deck that is, seasonless. It's not time of day specific, none of these other things. It's an everyday deck. I read with it quite a lot. So those are my choices for those. Number 6 is overrated versus underrated. And this, whenever this is in a prompt or like in a tag, and I feel like there have been some other tags that in some way have asked us to talk about decks being overrated or underrated, I'm quite challenged by this, right? This is obviously going to be totally subjective. And when I say what I think is overrated, maybe some people will give me some trouble for it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't like calling a deck underrated because it's like, I don't know. It's not to say that people don't like it or something like that, right? So I always feel like there's a lot of caveats on these kinds of things. Now, overrated. The deck that I have chosen to call overrated is the Smith-Waite. I don't feel like I have to say too much more than that. And I don't mean this specific version. This is the Centennial. And in terms of a Smith-Waite version, this is actually the version that I really like. So it's not that the Centennial is overrated, but I think the Smith-Waite is overrated. I don't think you need to have this as your first deck. I don't think that you have to own this deck at all. It is the default deck in many tarot books. I don't think that means that it's a deck for everybody. And I think that very often it is treated that way. Like it's absolutely vital, like for every tarot collection to contain some sort of variant of this deck. And obviously there are tons of variants of this deck. There's the Centennial Borderless, there's the yellow plaid backs, there's the, what is that called? Radiant Wise Spirit that's got the colorful backgrounds. There's the versions in a tin. There's all of these different kinds of Smith-Waite. Like there's one for everybody or something, but like I don't actually think that that's true. So that's why I think this deck is overrated. I think that there's a lot of barriers really in this deck. Clearly it's not very diverse at all. It has a lot of Christian kinds of imagery in it that not everybody's going to want to work with, and that's fine. That is completely fine. And so that's why I think it's overrated. I like the Centennial. I will have this in my collection, for sure. Overrated doesn't mean that I loathe it and don't want anybody to have it and don't want it myself, not at all. But I do think it is touted as being essential in ways that I don't think it is. And so that is why I chose overrated Smith-Waite. Underrated, again, this isn't a deck that I've heard anyone suggest is bad, so it's not underrated in that way. This is a deck that I adore, that I never see on TarotTube. So that's why I think that it's underrated. And that's the Architect's Tarot by Yusuf Bushiri. This is a beautiful deck. And from an interview I saw, the creator seems like a lovely person as well. And this was a Kickstarter. I missed the Kickstarter. I kicked myself very hard for missing the Kickstarter, and so I immediately ordered it afterwards. It has silver gilding. These are the backs. It has an amazing shuffle. This is a matte cardstock. It has no sticking whatsoever. This would be another favorite shuffle. It's really nice. And it's architectural. It has panoramas in it, so the cards connect in a panorama. It's color-coded. So the cups, for example, have the blue frame. And it really plays in interesting ways with perspective and size that I think are interesting. I feel like it's traditional enough that it's legible, but it's unique enough to be compelling. The colors are very soft. It's watercolor. It's ink, pen, and watercolor. So the colors are very, very soft. Really beautiful. The figures are all this kind of silhouetted, so it reads very neutral in the sense of its representation. Like, it's not, like, the cards don't feel gendered to me. There is a nod to astrology in the majors there. And the fact that I never see this deck around makes me feel that it's underrated. I think this deck is fabulous. And I hope that he makes an Oracle deck, because I would buy it in a second. This has become one of my favorite readers. It has an extra card, which is the Architect. Major number 22. You could use it as a significator if you want to. I shuffle it in. I like it. I don't use a lot of extra cards, but I do like that one. Really, really cool deck. And, you know, it had a successful Kickstarter. So I know that I'm not the only person who has it, not by a long shot. But I think that this is a great deck that doesn't get enough hype as it deserves. So that's my underrated deck, the Architect's Tarot. Overrated. Smith-Waite. Sorry, not sorry. That's what I think. Now, the final set of opposites or extremes is speaks to your conscious versus speaks to your unconscious. And so for that, I had to think for a minute about what that kind of meant to me and why I would make that distinction. But this actually does make sense to me as a way of thinking about decks. So I was glad that this was included in that way. I don't use the language of light and shadow in this way, which the prompt also used, but Marlena explained it in terms of speaking to the conscious and speaking to the unconscious. So that I can absolutely make sense of. And so for speaking to the conscious, I chose philosophy cards. And philosophy cards is a very unconventional, pippish deck that is based on existential philosophy. Existential philosophy, or existentialism, very much speaks to the conscious mind. We see suits like action and reason. And existential philosophy is very interested in how people make decisions, responsibility for one's actions, the possibility of freedom and making decisions in a free way. Existentialism is way too big of a topic to try to talk about in a video like this. When we think about existential philosophers as people like Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir, these are existentialist thinkers. And so this deck very much demands that I engage my conscience. It takes a lot of thinking to read with. This is one that I would kind of analyze my readings with. I do like the guidebook that came with this. It has some quotations from different philosophers in it. And the major arcana are all kind of philosophical concepts or figures from mostly existential or like maybe proto-existentialist, people who influenced existentialist philosophers are in the majors. So we have Zarathustra. Thus spoke Zarathustra from Friedrich Nietzsche. Eternal return is also a Nietzschean concept. So this is very much a thinking deck for me. It's a really interesting one. I enjoy it. I enjoy the guidebook. It's not one that I'm going to pull out and read with lightly, though. I do want to, really spend some time with, any reading that I do with this deck. It's not like a quick yes/no kind of reading deck for me. So that's the deck that speaks to my conscious. Finally, for the last one, the deck that speaks to my unconscious. And for this one, I chose the Margareta Peterson Tarot. And I think that there's, a number of decks in my collection that I could have picked for either side of this set of opposites, speaking to the conscious and the unconscious. But this one came to mind for speaking to the unconscious because it's very abstract. And when I look at this deck for a reading, I tend to kind of just lose myself in these images and explore them. And it's very much kind of exploring and being lost in. It's not a kind of analysis like I might experience with the philosophy cards. And so these two decks feel very different to me. I really like this deck. When I engaged with TarotTube early on, I saw this deck on a few different channels and I was like totally captivated by it and had no clue what to do with it. I was fascinated and intimidated simultaneously of this deck. It's like, that, I don't know what you would do with that, but it's beautiful. And I'm glad that I got it. It's an interesting one to read with, but very much for me speaking to the unconscious more so in its style. So that's the last of it. Speaking to the conscious, philosophy cards, and speaking to the unconscious, the Margareta Peterson Tarot. So that is my VR for Tarot to the Extreme or Tarot Extremes. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've really been enjoying other folks' videos that I've seen who've done this tag and look forward to, of course, seeing more if other folks decide to make a VR even later than me. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you to Marlena Teresa for starting the tag as well. Have a great day, and I'll see y'all again soon. Bye.